A boot slammed down on an old man's chest. He hit the wet pavement and skidded across it. Two more shapes closed in fast. Fists swung. Boots kicked at his ribs again and again. He curled up and took every blow. He didn't fight back, not one swing. Rain came down in sheets. Blood ran pink into a puddle by his cheek. A dog barked somewhere close, wild and desperate, chains snapping tight against a post. His name was Duke Malloy, 61 years old. 30 years a road captain, and he was letting 3 men beat him half to death in a diner parking lot without lifting a hand. Why would a man like that just lie there and take it? Why would he choose to? The answer had walked out of that diner 20 seconds earlier, and she was about to change everything. Stay with me on this one. Let me back it up. A week before that beating, none of it had happened yet. Every morning at 6, a little diner off Route 66 outside Flagstaff turned on its lights, and every single morning Duke Malloy was the first man through the door. Same stool, far end of the counter, back to the wall, eyes on the front. 30 years on a motorcycle hadn't taught him much, but it taught him that. Never sit where you can't see who's coming in. He'd order black coffee and dry wheat toast. He'd leave a 5 under the saucer, and he'd sit there for an hour with a scarred German shepherd curled up on his boots. The dog was named Bandit, and no other soul in that diner was allowed to lay a hand on him. Bandit had one torn ear and a hitch in his back leg, same as his owner. The two of them looked like something the road had chewed up and spit out. Duke wore his cut every day. You know what that is, the leather vest, the colors, Hell's Angels across the back, faded and cracked from 1,000 miles of sun. On the front, over his heart, were photographs, little laminated squares sewn into the leather. Men on bikes, men with their arms around each other, men who were young once and grinning and alive. Most of them were dead now. That was the thing nobody said out loud. Duke didn't talk. Not to the trucker 2 stools down, not to the cook, not to anybody. He'd nod. That was it. A nod was the whole conversation. Folks around there had learned to leave the big gray-bearded biker alone, and that suited him fine. He liked being left alone. He'd built a whole life out of being left alone. Then Cora Vane started her shift. She was 26, new in town. She'd taken the morning counter 3 weeks back, and from the first day, she did the one thing nobody was supposed to do. She talked to him. "Refill, honey," she'd say, and she wouldn't wait for the nod, she'd just pour. Duke figured she'd learned, same as everybody learned. Give the old man his coffee, take his 5, move on. But Cora didn't move on. She lingered. She'd lean on the counter across from him and look at those photos on his chest like they were the most interesting thing she'd ever seen. "Who's that one?" she asked one morning, pointing at a young man on a chopper. "The one laughing." Duke didn't answer. "He's got a good laugh," she said. "You can tell, some people you can just tell." She refilled Bandit's water bowl without being asked, set it down by the dog's nose. And here's the thing that got Duke. Bandit let her. That dog had bitten a man's hand nearly through the bone 2 years back for reaching too fast. But when Cora set down that bowl, Bandit thumped his tail once against the floor and looked up at her like she'd hung the moon. Duke noticed that. He noticed everything. It's how he stayed alive. "He likes you," Duke said. First words he'd spoken to her in 3 weeks. Cora smiled like she'd won something. "Course he does, I'm likable." Now you'd think a moment like that would open a man up. It didn't. It scared him. Because Duke Malloy had spent a long time making sure he didn't need anybody, and a young woman with a warm smile who his own dog trusted was exactly the kind of thing that could take all that careful work apart. So he did what he always did. He pulled back. "You shouldn't waste your mornings on an old man," he told her, quiet, not looking up. "Go talk to somebody your own age, somebody with a future." Cora just poured him more coffee. "Who says I'm wasting them?" He didn't have an answer for that. He left his 5 and walked out into the cold, Bandit limping along beside him, and he told himself he'd sit somewhere else tomorrow. Somewhere she wasn't. He didn't. He came back the next morning. Same stool. Because the truth was, that hour at the counter had become the only part of his day that didn't ache. Let me tell you what Duke's life actually looked like, so you understand what she was up against. He lived alone in a single-wide trailer 40 minutes out on a scrap of land he owned free and clear. No wife. No kids that he knew of. The brothers he'd ridden with for 3 decades were mostly gone now. Prison took some. The road took more. Cancer, that slow, quiet killer, took the rest. Duke had carried 6 coffins in 10 years. He'd run out of men to call. He kept a coffee can on a shelf in that trailer. Every month he took cash out of it, folded it into an envelope, and drove to the post office. He never said who it was for. He'd been doing it for 20 years, and it was the one thing that still made him feel like a man worth the leather he wore. That envelope matters. Hold on to it. We'll come back to it. Cora, meanwhile, kept chipping away. Every morning, one more question. One more refill. She learned he took his toast dry. She learned Bandit liked the corner of the bacon. She learned that if she hummed while she wiped the counter, the old man's shoulders came down from around his ears, just a little. And Duke learned things about her without meaning to. That she rented a room above the hardware store. That she had no family she talked about. That when a group of loud men came in and got rough with their words, something in her face went flat and careful, like she'd seen worse and was measuring the distance to the door. He recognized that look. He'd worn it his whole life. One rainy morning, she came around the counter with a rag and knelt down by Bandit, and the dog rolled right over and showed her his belly. Duke watched a young woman scratch the chest of the meanest animal he'd ever owned, and he felt something crack open in the middle of him that he'd bricked up a long time ago. "You ought to be careful," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it. "A girl like you, in a place like this. With a man like me." Cora looked up at him from the floor, rain running down the window behind her, and she said the thing that started it all. "What if a man like you is exactly what I came here for?" Duke didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. He thought she was just being kind. He thought she was young and didn't know better. He had no idea she'd come to that town on purpose. He had no idea she'd been looking for him for 2 years. That morning the door opened and 3 men walked into the diner, and nothing about Duke's quiet life was ever going to be quiet again. The first one through the door was wide as a truck, shaved head, a jailhouse cross tattooed on the side of his neck. The other 2 spread out behind him, easy and slow, the way men move when they're used to rooms going silent around them. Duke felt it before he saw it, that drop in the air. He set down his coffee. Under the counter, out of sight, his hand went flat and still. The big one walked straight to Duke's end and looked down at the photos on his chest. "Duke Malley," he said, not a question. "Been a long time, old man. You don't remember me, but you sure as hell remember my brother." Duke's face didn't move, but Cora, wiping a table nearby, went still. "Rooster Kane's brother," Duke said quietly. The big man smiled with no warmth at all. "Rooster got out last month, 20 years inside. You know why he did 20 years, Duke?" "Because an old road captain got up on a stand and pointed a finger. Because you talked." The whole diner had gone quiet. The trucker at the counter suddenly found his eggs very interesting. The cook drifted back toward the kitchen. "There's a hearing coming," the big man went on. "Cold case they're dusting off. And Rooster's lawyer says there's exactly 1 man left alive who was there that night. 1 witness. You." He leaned down close. "Rooster wants you to forget, real bad, and he sent us to help your memory along." Now here's what you have to understand about Duke Malley. 20 years back, on a run out past the canyon, Rooster Kane had set up an ambush. It went wrong. And a young prospect, barely 22 years old, had thrown himself between the guns and Duke and taken the bullets that were meant for the road captain. That boy died in Duke's arms in the dirt. His name was Webb Vane, and Duke had testified against Rooster Kane not for the club, not for revenge, but because that boy's blood was on his hands and he couldn't live with it any other way. Duke had spent 20 years paying for it, that coffee can, those envelopes. All of it went to Webb Vane's family, to the wife, to the little girl. He stood up off the stool, slow. He put himself between the three men and the rest of the diner, and he kept his voice low and even. "Not in here," he said. "There's people eating." "Then let's take a walk," the big man said. And Duke Malley, who could still put a man on the floor if he had to, looked past those three at a young waitress standing frozen with a coffee pot in her hand, and he made a decision. If it turned into a brawl in that diner, somebody innocent got hurt, somebody like her. So he walked out the door into the rain, all three of them following, Bandit going wild on his chain by the fence. And then something strange happened. Out in the lot, the big man's phone buzzed. He listened. His jaw tightened. He held up a hand to the other two. "Not today," he muttered. He jabbed a finger into Duke's chest. "Rooster's still deciding how he wants this done. You got a few days, old man. Enjoy your coffee." And they climbed into a black truck and pulled out onto the highway and were gone. Just like that. Duke stood in the rain a minute, letting his heart slow down. Then he walked back inside, dripping, and he sat back down on his stool like nothing had happened. His hands were steady. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. Cora came over without a word and poured him a fresh cup, hot, and set it down in front of him. Her hand was shaking a little. His wasn't. "You okay?" she whispered. "Fine," he said. "It's nothing." The trucker went back to his eggs. The cook fired the grill back up. A song came on the little radio behind the counter, and slowly the whole diner let out its breath and settled back into a normal, ordinary morning. Duke figured Rooster would send a message, drag it out. That's how men like that worked. He had days. He'd handle it his own way, quiet, keep everybody else out of it. He drank his coffee. Bandit settled back onto his boots. Outside, the rain eased to a drizzle. For about 90 seconds it was over. Then the door opened again. It wasn't the three men. It was a boy. A kid, maybe 18, soaked to the skin, and he walked straight up to Cora and pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand and said, "A man out front told me to give you this." And then he turned and ran back out into the wet. Cora unfolded it, her face changed, and she turned the paper around so Duke could see. Block letters, one line, "We know who the girl is. You talk, she pays." Duke's blood went to ice, because this wasn't about him anymore. He could take a beating, he could take a bullet. He'd been ready to die for 20 years and would have counted it a mercy. That was the whole story he'd been telling himself. An old man with nothing left to lose. But now there was her. "What does it mean?" Cora asked, and her voice was small. "Duke, who's the girl? Who do they mean?" He stood up. He looked out the window at the empty highway where that black truck had gone. And the thing he'd built his whole quiet life around, the idea that hurting him couldn't cost anybody anything, was gone. Just like that. They'd found the one person on earth he couldn't stand to lose, and he didn't even fully understand yet why she was that person. He only knew that she was. "Get your coat," he said. "What?" "You're not walking home alone. Not today. Not until I fix this." Cora set down the coffee pot. "Duke, you're scaring me. Tell me what's going on." And for the first time in 20 years, Duke Malley sat back down and told somebody the truth. He told her about the run past the canyon, the ambush, Rooster Kane. He told her about a young prospect who threw his own body in front of the guns and saved a road captain who didn't deserve saving. He told her the boy died in the dirt with his hand gripping Duke's collar, and that his last words were, Look after them for me." "So I did," Duke said. "For 20 years, every month. I sent them everything I had, kept a roof over that boy's widow, kept his little girl fed and in shoes, never signed my name, didn't want them thanking the man their husband and daddy died protecting. Some debts you don't get to be thanked for." Cora had gone very, very still. "The boy's name," she said, barely a whisper. "What was his name?" Duke looked at her, not understanding why she'd gone white. "Webb," he said. "Webb Vane, good kid, best of us." The coffee pot slipped out of Cora's hand and shattered on the floor. And before I tell you what she said next, I have to say this. If you've made it this far with me, if this story's got its hooks in you, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one, the ones about loyalty and second chances and the debts we carry, they only reach folks like you when you help them along. So subscribe and let's finish this together. Because what Cora said next stopped that whole diner cold. "Vane," she said. "My name is Cora Vane." Duke didn't move, couldn't. "My daddy died when I was 6 years old," she said, and her voice was shaking now, tears standing in her eyes. "Somewhere out past the canyon. My mama never talked about how. She just said he died a hero and that somebody was watching over us. Every month an envelope came. Cash, no name, never a name. My whole childhood that envelope was the only reason we ate. The only reason I had shoes. The only reason my mama didn't lose the house." Duke's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "My mama passed 2 years ago," Cora went on. "And when I was cleaning out her things, I found them, all of them, every envelope saved. And in the last one you got careless, or maybe you got old, or maybe some part of you wanted to be found. There was a return slip, a name, Mal, and a town." She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "So I looked, 2 years I looked, and I found a diner outside Flagstaff where an old biker drinks black coffee every morning with photos of dead men sewn over his heart. And one of those photos, the young one, the one who's laughing." Her voice broke clean in half. "That's my daddy, isn't it?" Duke looked down at the photo on his chest. The laughing boy, Webb Vane, 22 years old, forever. "Yeah," he said. His voice was gone to gravel. "That's your daddy." For a long moment nobody in that diner breathed. "I didn't come here to thank you," Cora said. "I came here to hate you, maybe. I don't even know. I came to see the man who kept sending money like it could buy back my father. And instead I found a lonely old man who feeds bacon to a broken dog and leaves a $5 tip on a $2 coffee and can't look anybody in the eye. And somewhere in these 3 weeks, without meaning to, She stopped. Duke stood up. He put money on the counter. His hands were shaking now. His, not hers. "You should go," he said. "Home, away from here, away from me. You hear? Rooster Kane is going to come, and he is going to come hard, and everybody who stands near me gets hurt. Your daddy stood near me, and it killed him. I won't watch that happen to his little girl. You're too young for this. Too young for an old Hell's Angel who's got nothing but a grave waiting on him." He turned to walk out. Bandit rose up limping to follow, and Cora came around that counter and caught his sleeve. "You listen to me, Duke Mal," she said, and the whole diner heard it. "You gave up 20 years of your life for a debt you didn't even owe. You paid for my shoes, my school books, my mama's medicine at the end. You've been the invisible hand holding up my whole life since I was 6 years old, and you never once asked for a single thing back." She stepped in close, right up against his chest, right up against the photos of the dead. "You said I'm too young for you, too broken down and too far gone. Well, to me, you're perfect. You have always been perfect, and I am not going anywhere." Duke Mal, 61 years old, who had buried 6 brothers and never cried at a single funeral, stood in that little diner and wept. And that's when the black truck came back. You already know how this part goes. You saw it at the start. Duke saw the truck through the window and he moved fast for a man his age. He put Cora behind him hard and he shoved her toward the kitchen. "Back door," he said. "Run, take Bandit, now." "No. Don't argue with me. Not now. Get her out," he said to the cook, and shoved Bandit's leash into the man's fist, and Bandit fought it, snapping and barking because that dog knew. Dogs always know. Then Duke walked outside to meet them so it would happen in the lot and not around her. 3 men. Tire irons this time. The big one with the neck tattoo led the way. "Roosters decided," he said. "You don't get to testify if you can't walk into a courtroom. Nothing personal, old man." Duke could have run. He couldn't have won, not 3 against 1 at 61, but he could have run. He didn't, because as long as they were beating on him, they weren't looking for her. So he stood his ground in the rain, and the first swing took him across the shoulder and spun him down onto the wet pavement. And that's where you came in. A boot on the chest, fists, boots to the ribs. An old man curled up in a puddle, taking it, not fighting back, blood running pink into the rain. Bandit going insane against the chain by the fence. They meant to kill him. You could see it in how they worked. Cold, thorough. The big one raised the tire iron up over his head to bring it down on Duke's skull, and Duke looked up through the blood and the rain and thought, all right, this is a fair price. Webb, I looked after her. I did what you asked. She's safe. Let me come see you now, brother." He closed his eyes. The tire iron never came down, because Cora Vane had not run. She'd broken free of the cook. She'd grabbed the one thing in that kitchen that could matter, and she'd let Bandit off the chain. 70 pounds of scarred German Shepherd hit the big man in the back like a cannonball, and the tire iron flew, and the man went face first into the mud with a dog's jaws locked on his arm. The other 2 spun around, and that's when they heard it. The thunder. Down the highway, out of the gray, came headlights. A lot of them. 2 dozen, 3 dozen more. The deep rolling growl of Harley engines all running together, the sound Duke Malloy had lived his whole life inside of, the sound of brothers coming. Because here's the thing Cora had done. In the 90 seconds she had before she let that dog loose, she'd grabbed Duke's phone off the counter and she'd hit the one number he still kept, the number for the last of the old crew, and she'd screamed one word into it. Mal. And that word still meant something. It would always mean something. They came up that highway 40 strong. Old men, most of them, gray beards and bad knees and cuts as faded as Duke's own. But they came, and they came fast, and they poured off those bikes and into that parking lot. And Rooster Kane's 3 men took one look at the tide coming at them and ran for the truck. They peeled out onto the highway, and 6 bikes peeled out after them, and that was the last that lot ever saw of them. Duke lay in the rain, broken and bleeding and alive, and he opened his eyes to see Cora Vane on her knees in a puddle beside him, holding his ruined face in both her hands, sobbing, saying his name over and over. "I've got you," she was saying. "I've got you, you stubborn old fool, I've got you, don't you dare leave me too." And Bandit, blood on his muzzle, pressed himself against Duke's other side and would not be moved. Duke Mal looked up at the daughter of the man who died to save him, the girl he'd kept alive from the shadows for 20 years, the woman who'd walked into his diner and refused to let him be alone. "You didn't run," he whispered. "No," she said, laughing and crying both. "I don't run, I get that from my daddy." The ambulance came. So did the law. Rooster Kane's men got picked up 2 counties over, and with them in custody and Duke's testimony still standing, that cold case closed for good. Rooster Kane went back inside, this time for the rest of his natural life. He never came near either of them again. Duke spent 9 days in the hospital, 3 cracked ribs, a broken cheekbone, a concussion that made the room spin for a week. The doctors said a man his age shouldn't have survived it. Cora never left. She slept in the chair by his bed every single night. Bandit, who the hospital absolutely did not allow inside, spent every one of those nights curled up outside the main doors, and no amount of shooing could move him. And after the third day, the nurses just started bringing him water. The old crew came too. One at a time, all week, those gray-bearded outlaws filed through that hospital room. They'd stand by the bed, awkward and gentle, and they'd tell Cora stories about her father, the laughing boy, the best of them. She learned who her daddy was that week from the men who'd loved him, and she wrote every story down in a little notebook so she'd never lose a single one. That notebook. That's the last thing I need you to remember. Hold it a second. On the 9th day, they let Duke go home. Cora drove him. Not to the trailer 40 minutes out. She'd already moved his things. She drove him to a little rented house in town, near the diner, with a fenced yard for Bandit and a porch that caught the morning sun. "I can't ask you to do this," Duke said, standing in the doorway of a home he hadn't chosen. "You're 26 years old. You've got your whole life. I'm a busted-up old man. You deserve somebody whole. Somebody with years ahead of him, not somebody with more years behind." Cora set down his bag. She took his scarred, swollen hand in both of hers. "You keep telling me what I deserve," she said softly. "Like you get a vote. My father gave his life so you could keep yours. And you took that life, and you spent 20 years of it making sure a little girl you never met had a future. You don't get to tell me you're not worth loving, Duke. You're the most loved man I ever heard of. You just never stood still long enough to notice." She reached up and touched the photo on his chest. The laughing boy. "He'd want this," she said. "I know he would. He asked you to look after me. Well, let me look after you now. Let somebody for once." And Duke Malley, who had been alone for so long he'd forgotten it was a wound and not just a fact, finally set the weight down. They were married the next spring in a field outside Flagstaff, 40 motorcycles parked in the grass and 40 old outlaws in their Sunday cuts. Cora wore her mother's dress. Duke wore his colors, and over his heart, right next to the photo of her laughing father, he'd sewn a new photo. Her. Cora on the porch in the morning sun with one hand on Bandit's head. Some folks talked, sure. An old gray biker and a girl 35 years younger. Let them talk. They didn't know. They didn't know about the envelopes or the field or the boy who died in the dirt or the debt a good man paid for 20 silent years without once asking to be thanked. Bandit lived 3 more good years sleeping in the sun of that fenced yard, and when he finally went, he went easy with his head in Duke's lap and Cora's hand on his side. They buried him under the porch he loved. Duke cried like a child. Cora held him, that's what she did. She held him. Duke's still out there, last I heard. Older now. Slower. But every morning at 6, he's the first man through the door of that little diner off Route 66, and he's not sitting alone anymore. Cora's behind the counter, pouring his coffee before he asks. And when a stranger points at the photos on his chest and asks who they are, Duke doesn't nod and look away like he used to. He tells them. Every name. Every story. He tells them about the laughing boy who saved his life, and about the girl who walked in off a rainy curb and gave it back to him. Remember the start of all this. An old man on the ground in the rain, taking a beating, choosing not to fight, ready to die for something he could barely explain. Now you know what it was. It wasn't that he had nothing left to lose. It's that, for the first time in 20 years, he finally had everything. And he'd have laid down in that rain 1,000 times over to keep her walking in the sun. To her, he was perfect. Gray beard, broken ribs and all. And that, my friends, was more than enough.